Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. As some of you may know, I mentioned how I had several videos in the pipe. I had recorded them, I was working on them, and I think on at least one, if not two occasions, I said that I had an Afghanistan one coming. Well, that's this one, but with a slight difference now. When I recorded the first one, the Taliban were still on the offensive, rapidly taking provincial capitals, and Afghanistan was falling, and everyone was shocked at the scale of the collapse. And so that's what that video deals with, for the most part. Because as I will point out at various different points in the video, if we were paying attention, since as early as, 2010 to 2012, we would have seen the writing on the wall that Afghanistan was going to be a failure if and when we left. After all, it's been a 20-year occupation. But as the world has since learned, the entirety of the country has fallen back into the hands of the Taliban. The Taliban have entered the presidential palace in Kabul, and the scenes from the airport are horrifying. And so the addendum to this Afghanistan video is to also focus more on a point that I really only start to make in the last third of the video, about the people of Afghanistan and how we outright abandoned them. But there's still lots of things that we can do to help people. And so the way this video is going to work is that this beginning part is just a disclaimer, because I am not a military expert, I'm not a foreign relations expert, I am not an expert of any kind. And so I really want to stress that there are two things I want people to keep in mind as they watch this. I am angry that people were so ignorant about the situation and people being shocked at the level of and the speed of collapse in Afghanistan, and how we are just abandoning lots of people who helped us, and especially women, to horrible fates. This is not a haha, I was right. It's nothing like that. It is me venting frustration at a situation that didn't need to happen, and a way for us to also help the people of Afghanistan. On with the shit show, I guess. Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. A lot of people, including the media, are quote-unquote shocked by the sudden revival of the Taliban rolling through Afghanistan, basically rendering the whole 20 years occupation and war effectively useless. Now, here's the thing. There was an opportunity to fix Afghanistan, but we really squandered it with two major things. The first being the way the United States does warfare, and second, there was no involvement of regional players. And I know some people are saying, but what about Pakistan? I'll get to that over the course of this, which I will try and make very quick. What a lot of people don't know is that when the invasion of Afghanistan was first happening, Iran actually offered some help, because Iran has a variety of historic and cultural ties to Afghanistan. And so necessary for part of its own security, it wanted kind of a foot in the door. But it was part of the axis of evil, and so they weren't allowed, even though they had linguistic, religious, cultural, historic connections with various peoples in Afghanistan. Next up is Pakistan, but what Pakistan did was kind of ridiculous. See, Pakistan, since the whole war started, was very eager to be involved because there is a section of Pakistan known as the tribal area that borders Afghanistan, and it's very much full of, again, the Pakistani version of the Taliban and people who are ethnically related to people across Pakistan's western border, a border which, surprise, surprise, was drawn up by Western imperialists. I think it's called the Durand Line or something, but it was arbitrarily drawn by British bureaucrats to try and create Afghanistan, and that's also why it has a little Wakhan corridor at the north there, to create a buffer state between the British and Russian imperial zones of influence in Asia. Russians had Central Asia, Britain had South Asia, what we now call like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka. Afghanistan was the buffer zone, and that's why its borders kind of don't make sense. So Pakistan wanted to basically prevent itself from becoming its own tinderbox and a second proxy war to the US war right next door. That's why Pakistan tried to play America and the Taliban off of each other for its own security purposes, which is understandable, But it backfired because, again, Pakistan didn't want India to get influence in Afghanistan because Pakistan feared encirclement. But their involvement and helping the Americans led the Afghans to actually pursue a special security relationship with India because India sent a ton of peacekeepers to Afghanistan. So yeah, Pakistan's own actions kind of allowed for that to happen. So these are the outside influences that were trying to be involved in Afghanistan. And one, Pakistan got involved, but not in necessarily a terribly good way. And the other, Iran, wanted to be involved, but was not because America no likey Iran. And then we have the actual situation in Afghanistan itself, where many forces, namely the big ones, didn't really want to get involved. The French and the Germans sent arguably a large number of troops, but in terms of what their own battle orders allowed them to go and do, meant that they were essentially useless outside of patrols and just showing numbers to try and discourage attacks. Most of the fighting in Afghanistan was done by the Americans, and then way down in second place, the Brits, and then behind them in even lower places, us, the Canadians, the Dutch, the Danes, the Estonians, very small nations. And so unfortunately, this led to a disparity in terms of how the ISAF NATO force actually operated. America, big number one, America, fuck yeah! Military might, shock and awe, blow up the entire mountainside to kill 3 guys. That is America, baby. Meanwhile, smaller forces recognizing, okay, so we're in a forward operating base. We're surrounded by people who we don't know, who probably don't like us. And the Taliban talk to them at night and say, by the way, you so much as breathe on these people, we will come back and kill you. Not exactly inclined to help out. So there was actually, I think it was even called the donut strategy that was developed by the Canadians, which was you go into a city, for example, Kandahar. You start there, you start small, you talk to people and on their terms. So what a lot of the Canadians and other small nations like the Danes and the Estonians and the Dutch were trying to do was engage the locals in terms relevant to them. Hey, look, we're really sorry about that firefight. It took out your orchard. We know that takes a long time to grow back. Here, we got you 50 goats instead. Please, again, mea culpa, we're very sorry. We're also going to send over the Army Corps of Engineers to rebuild the aqueducts and stuff that we unfortunately destroyed in the course of battle with our artillery and mortar fire. Again, our bad, but we're going to rebuild it for you for free. No worries. Again, please enjoy the goats. That was a real way of actually trying to win hearts and minds in local areas. And then the idea would be they try and spread that out to successive smaller villages and towns and smaller cities. And then the donut or whatever grows ever larger until the province is secure. The problem is that, again, the way American shock and awe worked was that, oh no, the Americans called in an airstrike. Shit, wrong target. That's a bunch of civilians dead. All that goodwill gone. This was documented on several occasions by several different armies. Adding to this was the problem of, again, this being the war where drone strikes took off. Rather than trying, covert operations at night, going to homes, raids, trying to find leaders in cells and stopping them, it was, you know what, we can just push a button and big ol' Reaper drone sends a missile and kills our guy. Sure, he takes out several other people with him, including the wedding party of civilians. But hey, that's one more dead terrorist. Or like, hey, look, we got lucky, we got 5 terrorists today. But that killed lots of civilians, which resulted in them not wanting to trust anyone because, again, we're all part of the same umbrella force. So while there were some smaller forces trying to, do the right thing and befriend the locals and work with them for their own security and to reduce stress and actually accomplish the aims of Afghanistan, which was to secure it, try and dismantle the Taliban and keep them away and foster a new, better, more progressive Afghanistan, that could have worked, but we had too many different armies trying different ways of how to win the war and win hearts and minds in Afghanistan. And now, unfortunately, this brings us to the Afghan forces themselves. I remember a big deal being made back around 2010 thereabouts about, yeah, it's been like nearly a decade of this war. We should think about how we're going to step back from this. And so the talk and the focus shifted to the Afghan security forces. There's two main forces we need to care about. There's the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police. The Afghan National Army, semi-decent force, all things considered, basically kitted out by some of the best that the West has to offer. New fatigues, the best training that money and, Delta Force and JTF2 and SAS can buy. On paper, good stuff. Problem was the, again, cultural way in which Afghanistan and its military operates. Before the war, again, you had a bunch of warlords. So everyone was loyal to different warlords or regions or clans or families. It is a very tribal society over there. And so trying to cobble together a military from all these different tribes and ethnic peoples means it was actually very separate. So some got more funding and training than others. Others didn't trust each other. So there wasn't really a kind of cohesive Afghan force. It's more like, yes, the Hazara militias that have now been absorbed into the Afghan National Army now have to fight alongside the Uzbek militias with the Pashtun militias. And if you're wondering, no, these people are not similar at all. So that was one of several fundamental problems. Again, I'm just really trying to sum up a lot of stuff here. The second and worst problem was the Afghan National Police, which was notoriously corrupt. They would go and extort people. Extrajudicial killings happened. They would, trigger warning here about sexual violence, assault and rape women and boys. And unfortunately, the Afghan National Police were the force that many Afghans had to deal with more often than, say, the Afghan National Army or any of the foreign armies. And again, because of corruption and tribal differences and loyalty to previous militias or family ties, whatever the various reasons might be, many soldiers and policemen were not paid, which is why they turned to corruption and extortion and extrajudicial murders and assassinations. So the, force that represents Afghanistan to your average local Afghan or Pashtun or Uzbek or Hazara, why would they want to support these people? We're expecting them to support us and these groups that we've uplifted and upheld rather than the Taliban? The locals don't care. So we lost the war from the moment we failed to meaningfully address and work within the local cultural understanding of Afghanistan. That was our first failure, and that happened years ago. And then more recently, with the whole aspect of, hey, now we're pulling out, Afghanistan is being left on its own because we didn't really work with the people around, for better or for worse. America did not, sit in a room solemnly with Pakistan, Iran, China, Tajikistan, maybe Turkmenistan also borders them, I forget. But they didn't work with regional partners to try and find a kind of regional framework for helping invest in Afghanistan and support it post-transition. So now Afghanistan is basically a free-for-all for whoever's there. The Taliban, Pakistan, Iran, China. But there's no cohesive, organized way of trying to tackle this and manage this. And so for all these factors and countless more, which I didn't even have time to mention, Afghanistan has absolutely crumbled in the wake of America leaving because it wasn't properly built up in the first place. And anyone who paid attention could have seen the writing on the wall as far back as 2012, if you were really astute, 2016, if you were even just modestly paying attention. And so here we are, 20 years later, hundreds of thousands of civilians dead, and Afghanistan no better for it. And yet so many are surprised by our failure, when our failure was written in stone the minute we failed to consider working within the bounds and realms that the Afghans themselves know and respect. It was the height of our imperialism trying to say to them, no, we know better. Here's how it works in our corner of the world that we found very successful. And you just have to accept that. It takes more than 20 years to fundamentally change a country and a culture and a society. Republican France in the 1700s is not the same Republican France of today. It takes time for things to happen. And so unfortunately, here we are with the world being shocked at the scale of collapse of Afghanistan. And no one's saying the quiet part out loud about, was the sacrifice worth it? Were the dead Americans, Canadians, Brits, Australians, Estonians, Dutch, Germans, French, Danes, Greeks, etc., were the thousands of deaths from Western soldiers over the course of 20 years worth it when we see what's happening right now, and it is in many ways a failure of our own design? No one's daring to ask that question and do some real soul searching into where we failed and how we failed. And the reason why I want people to do that is because this will happen again. Either America or someone else will go into Afghanistan or some other nation in another corner of the world. And we will make the same mistakes, and the end result will be just like Afghanistan. And that's what's bothering me today.
سایکو بچه من تیگ آلاست یک از صبح 8 بجه که نیم موتورها مقسم بند است تا بالا کلش بند است کاملا تا سر بند است مردم کلش پیاده میدوند.
That is a massive traffic jam in Kabul, Afghanistan. People rushing to the airport or just out of town to try and flee across the border, based on reports that the Taliban have entered the city. And some reports from Al Arabiya are saying that the Taliban might even just form a new interim government, and there's talks with them to do that. President Ashraf Ghani has already left the country, allegedly, into Tajikistan. People said 90 days, some people said 30. It's been 6. I have an Afghanistan video kind of in the pipe, and I waver on whether to add some more to it or just not do it at all, because I don't just want to be, again, that foreigner saying we kind of saw the writing on the wall as early as 2010. But I just really feel for all the people in Afghanistan who didn't want the Taliban. You see that so clearly here. We've seen it with interviews with activists in other towns and cities across the country where they're just having to come to terms with the fact that they or their families or their colleagues might be killed. Their schools might be burned, closed, bombed. It is just so unfortunate. And we're abandoning these people who we promised to help and who also helped us. And racists abound everywhere saying, well, no, we shouldn't take in a single Afghan refugee. Thousands of Afghans helped either try and find bin Laden. They wanted to improve their local station and the situations for their families in their local towns and villages. This is such a complex issue. And so I can't sum it up here. I can't even sum it up in its own video. And I'm just so exasperated by it all. My heart just goes out to the Afghan people who not only had to deal with Western bullshit for 2 decades and indiscriminate bombing campaigns and suicide bombings from the Taliban and retributions and reprisals. And it has been such a tumultuous and bloody time for them. And yet it's so clear that that time is nowhere near over. Hi, me again. So there we have it, the bulk of my summative thoughts on Afghanistan. And not once did I lay direct blame at a single nation or a single president, and yet for some fucking reason that's the discourse today. It was Bush, it was Obama, it was Trump, it's Biden. All of them are war criminals and all of them are complicit. The failure is so much bigger than them. And what's absolutely bothering me today is that at a time when we should be looking at the unfolding crisis and humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, we are playing politics instead of helping the Afghan people. The harrowing images of people clinging to planes as they leave Kabul. Women and activists basically resigning themselves to a summary execution in the streets by the newly enthroned Taliban. People like Afghanistan's first female mayor. I'm waiting for Taliban to come for people like me and kill me. I'm sitting here waiting for them to come. There is no one to help me or my family. I'm just sitting with them and my husband, and they will come for people like me and kill me. I can't leave my family, and anyway, where would I go? Afghanistan's few female soldiers rightfully fear for their lives. And then there are also the words of Mahbouba Siraj, who's the founder of the Afghan Women's Network, and she has a pretty potent message for world leaders.
To those world leaders, I'm going to say really shame on you. I'm going to say to the whole world, shame on you for what you did to Afghanistan. Why did you have to do what you did? And why are you doing this to this part of the world? I don't get it. I mean, are you using all of us? Are we being just the pawns in your hands? Is that what it is? I don't understand it. But I really, the fact that we don't have any hopes from you, and the fact that I don't even want to talk to you at all, because the talking time is over. We talked to you, we demanded, we asked, we did everything, and nobody paid any attention. They just made decisions with their gut feelings or whatever. All of these men of the world that they are in power, and they're destroying something that we worked so hard for. What is happening in Afghanistan today is going to put this country 200 years back again. And how are we going to do that? Again, for me, I'm not going to see anything good about this generation. I'm going to be gone. I won't even see my country doing what it's supposed to be doing. Not only me, but a whole lot of other people. Even for the young generation, what are we going to do? Now there's going to be an exodus of the Afghans again leaving this country. So what are we going to do? We are going to sit again and fight again and lose again, and then make another generation, and then for the world to make another stupid decision and destroy us all? Is this what it is going on? I don't understand it. I'm so sorry, I don't understand it. And thank you for giving me the time so I could say this to the world. We are disgusted.
And so again, I've provided the link that I provided in yesterday's video about ways to help the Afghans, and it is a very useful list by Bushra Ebadi. So according to her, here's a list of actions we can take and some things that we can avoid. If you are not an expert on Afghanistan, have not been keeping up with what has been occurring, and are not directly impacted by what is happening, don't share your unsolicited opinions and takes. Yes, I know I'm kind of guilty of this. Instead, follow and amplify the voices, work, and initiatives of Afghan activists, leaders, journalists, artists, and researchers doing that currently. Find out if your government is deporting Afghans back to Afghanistan. Many governments around the world were deporting Afghan asylum seekers and only recently paused deportations. Avoid simplistic narratives that paint the situation as an eternal dispute between tribes and factions. If you're not acknowledging the historic and ongoing role of various actors, then you're contributing to misinformation. The US and NATO allies benefited from the support of local Afghans who are being targeted. Reach out to your political representatives and leaders to ensure that efforts are being made to evacuate and resettle these individuals and their families. Has your country agreed to resettle Afghan refugees? Help support resettlement efforts, not just with monetary donations, but through community support. In Canada, you can sign up here to volunteer/donate. I've already done so. I encourage everyone else to do the same. Advocate for trauma-informed and culturally relevant supports for Afghan refugees and asylum seekers. Historically, mental health support has been underfunded and overlooked. PTSD, intergenerational trauma are real. Call for accountability and sanctions against actors who help bankroll the Taliban and provide them with training and arms. This article gives some context. Does your country sell weapons, military equipment, and surveillance tech to despots, human rights violators, oppressive regimes, and dictators? It's likely your taxpayer dollars are helping support these activities. Learn more here. Fund the work of Afghan peace builders and activists around the world, especially youth, women, and gender and sexually diverse persons. Speak out against the targeted attacks and ethnic cleansing of especially marginalized Afghan communities, including Hazara, Sikh, Hindu, and Shia Muslim people. Acknowledge the disproportionate cost of conflict on Afghan people. There has been a lot of rhetoric online about the costs of US and NATO has paid for its presence in Afghanistan, as well as blame on Afghan military forces. Stop legitimizing the Taliban in peace negotiations. They will not suddenly respect human rights, especially women's rights. Escalating Taliban attacks against journalists, school children, and persecuted religious and ethnic groups indicate the gravity of the situation. Displaced Afghans are being turned back at borders around the world. Support @Refugees' call to keep borders open to Afghans seeking asylum. She also has a separate thread where she points out that if you're an American journalist who has worked with Afghans when you were reporting on the country, you can check that thread out for ways in which you can help. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is not new, but is deepening, and there are funding shortfalls. Support the work that frontline UN agencies and humanitarian organizations are doing in Afghanistan. Amidst the escalating conflict, it is also vital that the international community mobilize to safeguard cultural heritage and sites in Afghanistan. Cultural cleansing and genocide threaten prospects for peace and contribute to the erasure of marginalized peoples. Are you an academic, researcher, or think tank who tangentially works on Afghanistan? Are you being asked to comment on the situation and give your take for media or speaking engagements? Politely decline and recommend an expert, preferably Afghan. Those are all things we and others can do. And I hate that the suffering of the Afghan people is quickly, like astonishingly quickly, fading into the background so that people can point political blame at whoever they feel is responsible. People here in Canada are already talking about how will this impact the election. Afghans are suffering, and we swore to them that we would help. Why isn't that the conversation? Why is it that the people most affected by this, and especially by our 20 years of actions as the West in Afghanistan, why are they not the focus and we're instead doing this politics shit? That's what's bothering me today.